Hello, so here we are in Dickens's Victorian London, a place of light and of dark, of rich and of poor. And I want to just kind of highlight to you how important it's going to be to include some of the details that help us to picture the real London, Dickens' real city. I need you to remember that a third of the marks available when you write about A Christmas Carol are awarded for comments on context. So the context is all about the world that this man lived in. You need to be thinking about how he portrays London, particularly Victorian London. Capital V, capital L. It's really important that you remember those details. Now the good news is that you do not need to be an expert, because Dickens is the expert. You just need to know his story. You need to think about what is presented to you in the novel. He was the expert because despite this being a ghost story, what he writes about is very real. The worries he has about what London is turning into, the experience of the people who live there is very real. And so you just need to pick up on what he tells you and to use it and to make it really obvious that these are depictions of Victorian London. So here we have a slide all about the things you can include if you want to write about Victorian London. You need to look at my list. It's got all sorts in it: poor quality education, hunger, poor living accommodation, a lack of healthcare, a lack of rights to protect workers, the church, desperate conditions leading people to do desperate things, the fact that there's a huge gap between the rich people and the poor people, and then thinking about references to prison, the poor law, the workhouse and the treadmill. And then right at the bottom you've got Gothic fiction, because this is what we call literary context. This is the idea that Dickens was working within a tradition. He was thinking about writing a certain type of story, and in this case it's the Gothic fiction, which was popular at the time, and I think he probably thought he could make some serious money on it. He didn't, by the way, but he thought he was going to. And he knew that ghost stories were very fashionable too, so he mixed those two up and he ended with this Christmas story. So that's the literary context. But I want you thinking about some of these other things, and you need to think about events in the novel that would link. So poor quality education, you might think about Scrooge's time at school. Hunger and want, you just need to think of characters who are hungry in the story, and you're going to end up writing about the Cratchits, I'm sure. Same with the poor quality living accommodation. There's a line in the story about the 4 rooms that the Cratchits live in. You can think about the lack of healthcare and the fact that Tiny Tim is not going to get better. There is no help for him. You could think about the way that Cratchit doesn't have any protection against the way that Scrooge treats him. This is someone who can't walk out of his office and pick up a lump of coal to keep warm because Scrooge won't let him. This is a man who tells him he's going to be sacked if he carries on talking about Christmas. This is a man who is told that he's a thief because he wants Christmas Day off, a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket, as Scrooge says. So I want you to be thinking about the real things that happen in the book that you could use to link to Victoria, okay, and to Victorian society. The church plays a part. We've got the gruff old bell that stares down at Scrooge. It's kind of looking down and it's very disapproving of his behaviour and what it does. And there's a point in the novel where the bells ring and everybody shuts up shop and has to go to church as if they're controlled by the bells. We need to think about the way people behave, the way that by the end of this novel, the future, when Scrooge is dead, people just strip him of all of his assets. They even take the shirt off his back and the sheets on his bed and the curtains surrounding them, and they sell it all away because they need the money, because they're desperate. So we need to be thinking about this huge gap between people with riches and people who just don't. And we also need to be looking for any references to prison. The idea that I think Scrooge thinks prison is a good thing, that it protects some people, and the poor laws, the workhouse and the treadmill, real things that happened at the time and things that you could find in the novel that you could write about. You don't need to be an expert on this subject. You just need to find examples of Dickens being an expert and making it really obvious. And if you do that, a third of your marks will be easy to obtain, because you'll just constantly remind your examiner, I'm writing about Victorian society. You just keep saying, Dickens was writing about Victorian education. Dickens was writing about the church in Victorian times. Dickens was writing about the difference between rich and poor in his own time. You just constantly refer to him living in his world. And if you do that, you'll be absolutely fine.